psychological first aid, a process for helping friends, families, colleagues, and others through stressful times. So the information that we're going to be talking about this evening is really geared towards helping people look at what personal resources they have to help them through stressful times, like the ones many of us are currently going through, or I guess I could say all of us are going through right now. So what this process of psychological first aid is a way to help ourselves and others in stressful situations. Sometimes they'll call this capacity building, or the ability to have groups of people in the community become aware of what traits they have that help them become resilient to deal with stress. So I try to make the information very pragmatic. There are a lot of techniques and things that people can use, and I'm going to talk about those different things. So before we get to those, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the process of stress and how we react to it. You know, we hear a lot about stress, but this is kind of maybe a little bit different way to look at stress and how it impacts each of us. So I sometimes I'm a quotes person. I don't know about you guys, but I love quotes. So this one is by Ernest Hemingway, the famous author. And he says, "The world breaks everyone, and afterward, many are strong at the broken places," which is definitely a quote that speaks to our capacity to become resilient. So in talking about this whole idea of stress, what we're trying to do is look at how stress impacts each and every one of us in different levels. So the first level would be physically. So when we get under prolonged stress or extreme stress, here are some potential ways that we may react to that stress physically. And you can look at that list, and maybe there are some that are particularly applicable to yourself, and maybe some aren't. But some of them are, you know, one of the things I hear about all the time are, you know, having difficulty sleeping and therefore feeling fatigue during the day or when trying to accomplish various tasks. And, you know, we know people can get agitated when they're under a lot of stress. We know that often stress affects us physically. And I think this was interesting, but this happened 10 years ago now. But the American Medical Association came out and said that stress is responsible for 75% of the physical ailments that we experience. So that's a pretty high number. I think before we didn't really look at stress that way as being potentially physically harmful. So there's some other things that you can look through and see if any of those are things that are particularly helpful for yourself. Excuse me. So the next one are stress reactions in us and how we respond on a feeling level. Okay, and so you can look down and see if there are any of those different feelings that you particularly respond to. So, I mean, there can be anything from rage, resentment, anxiety and fear, despair. Feeling numb is another thing. Sometimes people, in response to a lot of stress, feel that numbness, and it's almost like a way to kind of avoid having to deal with what they're feeling. Some people are terrified. Some people feel guilty. Some people feel helpless or out of control. Other people act like they're not interested at all. Other people, you can tell that they're very overwhelmed. So all of those reactions can apply. And you can see how they're all different. And that really speaks to the fact that each one of us is an individual, and we're going to react to stress in different ways. And I think that's why charts like this can be helpful. Sometimes I know people haven't even looked at stress impacting them in these different kinds of ways. And then stress can impact our thoughts, the thoughts that we're having. So it can be anything from impacting our ability to concentrate and to think. might be difficult for us to make decisions. We can become confused. It can bring about a distorted sense of time. I'm hearing that from a lot of people now. I don't know if you guys are, but they're like, "What is this? Is this Wednesday? Is it Thursday? What day is it?" You're kind of losing that sense of time in some ways, and that comes from kind of being under some stress, but also having our routines changed in some way. And so then there could be these ideas of self blame, worry, a sense of being cut off from reality, or in a very extreme situation, self harm. Okay. And so, in talking, those are some, that was kind of a wrap up about how stress can affect us in different ways. And again, maybe it was an opportunity for you to think about stress and its impact in a different way. So now we're going to kind of look at what are some of the risk factors and resiliency factors. So it could either be a risk factor or a potential resiliency factor for an individual when they face stress. So the first one on the list says psychological, but I think that speaks to the fact that we all have different personalities, and having different personalities, we're going to maybe have a different way to approach some type of crisis or a great deal of stress in our lives. And then the next one is, what is our capacity to tolerate stress, right? We all of us vary in that regard. Like there might be something that we're all facing. Like let's say the current crisis with COVID-19. I might be feeling overwhelmed, and you guys are saying, "Okay, I feel like I got this." But any given situation, there's going to be a difference, and a lot of it's going to be based on a person's capacity to tolerate stress. And even if it's not good at this point, that doesn't mean it's destined to always be bad. So there are things that we can do about it. Of course, what also plays into that is what is our prior trauma history, and maybe how have we dealt with crisis or trauma in the past, or not dealt with it. Other things like socioeconomics and education level can have a bearing on it. Family stability is important, as is social support. So having support systems can be a really positive resiliency factor in terms of stress. And then they talk about female gender being a resiliency factor because females tend to do a better job of processing stress. And that isn't meant to say that all females will handle it better, but they tend to because they will utilize support systems a little bit more readily sometimes than males will. And they will actually talk about an issue where potentially some males might feel like they don't want to make themselves vulnerable in that way. But again, it really varies by the individual. Here's a little bit about what definition about psychological resilience, and it really simply stated, it's the ability to effectively bounce back from stressful situations, including a crisis and a disaster. So we've learned, I'm sure you've heard about this word resilience, and in some ways, I think it's been overused in the last maybe 5-7 years. However, we continue to learn more and more about this whole process of resilience all the time, and then how it can be beneficial to each and every one of us. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next slide or two. But we know that everybody has resilience on some level. We know that resilience can be learned. We know that resilience can be enhanced and strengthened, and that it can help us adapt to changes and challenges that occur ongoing in our lives. And we say that we know this now because we used to think about resilience in a different way. Like we used to think that resilience was something people were either born with or they didn't have it. So we know now that that's not the case, that resilience can be strengthened. And it is one of the most important ways to help us bounce back from stress in our lives. And sometimes they'll call it a protective factor. You're going to see that word, those words used in subsequent slides. So they talk about resilience as a protective factor, something that keeps us from becoming too overwhelmed at times, and it gives us the ability to have hope that things can get better, even in the face of a lot of challenges. Okay, so here are some ideas about how to build resilience that we're going to talk about, and then each of you can look at these different resilience building techniques, and you can say, this is something I have in my life, this is something I don't have, or this is something that I want more of. So number one is making connections with other people, because it was mentioned in the slide before that it's social supports become important to help us bounce back. Like, some people are a little bit more gregarious than others, and they want to make more connections than others. But wherever you stand on that continuum of being gregarious or not, it is important that we have connections with other people, even if it's one or two people. So what happens to people sometimes, like even in this crisis now with COVID, I know a lot of people tended to just kind of go into a shell. And that whole process of isolation can be really difficult for people. So we know that over time, we've developed to feel safety in numbers. And so when we're isolated or forced to have social isolation, it can bring about feelings in us of not feeling safe. So having that lifeline, being able to make a connection becomes important. Maybe it's a friend or a family member or some other type of support. All of those are good things. And then the next one is to avoid seeing the crisis in front of us as being insurmountable. And I know that really sounds easier said than done, because I think sometimes when we see this huge crisis looming in front of us, it's almost like this wall that somebody sits in front of us, and it's really difficult to get over the wall or around the wall. And so it could become insurmountable in our minds. But what can become important for us in a situation like that is to think about, okay, this is a huge problem I'm dealing with, but what aspect of this problem can I have some control over? So maybe there's 4 or 5 things you have no control over, but maybe there's 2 or 3 things that you do have control over. So it can be important to say, okay, I can't control how long the kids are going to be home from school, but I can control a little bit about how I'm going to help to structure their day, or whatever it is for each one of us. Think about that in terms of what control, because I know in a crisis situation, what becomes really difficult for especially adults in a crisis is feeling a sense of loss of control, not being in control anymore. And for children dealing with a crisis, the primary concept for them is usually feeling this loss of safety. Like they don't feel safe, and they want to know who's going to protect them or who's going to keep them safe in the world. So, number 3, accept that change is a part of living. We're all going to be in a different place with this, and think about this for yourself. But how tolerant are you of change? And if you're not very tolerant for change, could you find ways to increase your tolerance for that? And that can be really important, because instead of fighting the change, if we accept it, it helps us to move forward. So think about it in terms of not, especially when change is inevitable, not fighting or resisting, but finding ways to work with it. The next one is finding ways to move toward your goals. So there's a couple things about this step. Like number one, when somebody's faced with a huge crisis, like the current one we're all dealing with, what's advisable is to tell people not to make sweeping changes. In the midst of something that you're already dealing with, you probably don't want to make a sweeping change. But what could be helpful is to set small goals for yourself and then move slowly towards those goals. So that is really the best that's the best way to do this when you're faced with some type of challenge, to not try to change things all at once. If we are able to move towards it and achieve a goal, it kind of gives us that sense of achievement. And it's a way of kind of feeling a sense of, we're not seeing it happening at the time, but it helps us with personal growth. Okay, and then I guess along with that is to take decisive action. So the more you can kind of make, if you look back and you think about that chart that talked about some of the symptoms of stress, decision making was one of them. And so it might be difficult for some people to make decisions. But if you can make some small decisions or decisive actions, it's also going to move you a little bit closer toward achieving your goals. All right, number 6 then is to look for opportunities for self-discovery. So I think this is a really important one in this list, because if you think about it, people almost always learn something about themselves in an adverse situation. And in adverse situations, we can't continue to do things the way we've always done them. We're forced to change in some way due to circumstances. And when those circumstances then can push us out of our comfort zone. And so it opens up an opportunity to look at things in a new way. And I know in Japanese culture, they use the same symbol for crisis as they do for opportunity. So that they look to see that a crisis is an opportunity to change in some way. And I know none of us are going to wake up and say, gee, I hope I have a crisis today so I can change in a positive way. But that is a potential outcome of dealing with a stressful situation or an adverse situation. And then, here's some things that self-discovery can bring about for people. It can increase their personal strength. It can give you a greater sense of self-worth. Sometimes people, and it depends on the individual, but they might develop a more well-rounded sense of spirituality. And it might give them a better appreciation for life. And you probably know people like this in your life, or maybe you're that person, but you dealt with something that was really serious. Like, for example, I have a colleague of mine who went through stage 4 cancer, and she was a principal of a school. And the way she approached her work was like she took every day as a gift, and she didn't get upset by the little things. And it was just a really powerful sense of herself coming into everything that she did, and a respect for everybody. So not everybody will see things that way, but it does provide opportunities like that to kind of view things in a little bit different way. And so you can also then, here's a couple questions you can ask yourself. When you're facing a crisis situation, what did you learn about yourself in that crisis situation? And what was it like? What was your interactions with other people like? And also think about maybe how have you been able to overcome obstacles in the past? I guess the third part about this self-discovery is being able to stay flexible. So this idea of staying flexible means being able to, and this is no small task either, but it's about being able to experience the powerful emotions that might come along with the crisis, and being able to instead of trying to fight against it or resist it, experience those emotions. And then maybe there's times that you have to kind of set those strong emotions aside because there are things you have to get done, right? And you might have to function in some way. So being able to set those aside, but then realizing that they're impacting you and dealing with them when it's appropriate to deal with them. Okay, the next one, number 7, is to nurture a positive view of yourself. And that becomes important in a lot of ways because if you, what happens too when people are going through a very stressful situation, like we tend to look at ourselves with a little bit lower self-esteem. We don't have the same self-concept when we're going through something really negative or challenging. So if you could just take a little bit of time and get in touch with who you really are and nurture that positive view of yourself, because that can help you become more resilient. There's a quote, or maybe it's more like a philosophy, but it says this: whatever you think, you will be. If you think you are weak, you will be weak. If you think you are strong, you will be strong. And that, though that might sound a little bit oversimplistic, the way that we nurture or think about ourselves has a pretty strong impact on our behaviors and how we act. Number 8 is keeping things in perspective. That I guess, if you have dealt with a lot of challenges in your life, it might be a little bit easier to put things in perspective, because you know that change is going to happen, and that maybe you've experienced tough times before, and tough times go, and sometimes tough times are there, sometimes they go. But it might be a little bit more difficult for children sometimes, because children tend to think that things are just going to be the same and that they should be the way they are. So as adults, we might be able to help them with our perspective, that things will change. Maybe that's the only constant in life, that there will be change, and that we can help them with that in some way. And maintaining a hopeful outlook. I guess that's one of the objectives of this course, is that it is to acknowledge that we are going to deal with tough times, but it becomes important to maintain a hopeful outlook. That doesn't mean it can't be realistic, but that it can be hopeful. That though we might be in times that are difficult now, later on, times can be different. And we know that much about how life works. And then the final one, number 10, is to take care of yourself. And I know we hear that a lot, but it's important to be reminded of that, because it's going to be difficult to take care of our families, take care of other people, unless we spend some time taking care of ourselves and making sure that we get what we need. So your personal needs matter, right? And you matter. So it's important to attend to those as well. And sometimes I like to advise people that, they tell me how much they care for their families and all the work that they put into taking care of their families. And I like to remind them that they should take that same caring and compassion that they put into helping other people and turn that on themselves for a period of time. So those are the suggestions about building resilience. The next slide talks about what some of the inner strengths are. And these are, you guys can take a look at this and see which ones you relate to. But these might fit under a larger umbrella of what they call emotional intelligence. So the more of these strengths of resilience that you have, the more emotionally intelligent you are too, and maybe better able to negotiate stress and challenges in your life. The first one being, and this holds true for all of us. The first one is emotional regulation. So again, being able to experience emotion, but being able to keep your feelings in check and stay goal focused. The other one is impulse control. We can learn so many ways to act and react, but then if we're very impulsive, sometimes all of those things go out the window and we just react. This third one's important because I see a lot of, especially young people, struggle with this one, causal analysis. So, people feel like they're under a lot of stress, and it's important to be able to accurately locate the cause of adversity. And then you'd be able to solve at least part of the problem. But if we're not really sure of the cause of the stress or adversity in our lives, sometimes we attribute it to things that aren't really the cause, and it keeps us stuck in this circle that sometimes people can't get out of. When you experience some success in this area, you can start to build your own self-efficacy. That's your belief as a problem solver. And I know some people sometimes don't feel very self-efficacious. They feel like they have to go to other people for help. And it's good that they're reaching out for support. But at some point, it would be important for them to stop to think about what are their skills, what makes them be able to solve their problems, and then inevitably believe in themselves. The next one is what we call realistic optimism. That's believing, that really goes along with hope, but believing in a bright future, but in accord with reality. And the next one is empathy. So that's really important in terms of understanding other people's feelings and what motivates them. And the last one is reaching out. And what reaching out really refers to is our willingness to take on new challenges and opportunities. And a lot of people are in different places in this regard. Some are very willing to do that, and some are a little bit more hesitant. But it can be very helpful to build resilience, to kind of take those steps forward and try something different. Christina, did anybody have any questions, or this might be a point for anybody to ask a question if they have it. Okay. Yeah, I see. Okay, that's fine. And we can ask questions at the end. And so the last one is, this isn't the last one, but the last one in this series are looking at personal resiliency builders. So what this chart does or exemplifies is that when each one of us gets into a very stressful situation, we tend to have go-to ways that we cope. And if you look at this chart, 1 to 16, maybe pick out the top 3 that you choose to utilize to help yourself cope. So, and it might change. You might look at this chart and say, I'm going to pick out 3. And then maybe tomorrow you might look at the chart and say, I don't know why I picked those 3. But, it may change a little bit. But, so I know for me, I might go with, I like to use humor. I like to nurture a positive view of the future. And I'm pretty self-motivated. So I think those are things that I kind of turn to when I get in under a lot of stress. So you guys can look at those and think about those different ways for yourself. Okay, so let's see how we're doing on time. Okay, so we have about 20 minutes. And then you have the opportunity to ask any questions if you want. But the next thing that we're going to talk about is kind of everything that we talked about so far was just building up to these steps that we're going to go through, and this idea of psychological first aid. So what that is a set of actions that can offer immediate help and support to people who are in need of help, right? And so here are the different steps that are involved. The thing about psychological first aid is that all of us have probably practiced this at some point. So all of us have reached out to help people who were under a lot of stress, who were in need of something, maybe a friend, maybe a family member, in a lot of different capacities. So all of us, in a way, have practiced psychological first aid already. So that's the good news about this. But what this did, what this program, Psychological First Aid, did was deconstruct that process. So they looked at, well, when we help somebody, well, what does it consist of? And what does it look like? And so it broke them down to these following steps. And sometimes these steps are going to blend together, like 2 or 3 steps might be involved in just greeting somebody. So we're going to go through them, and then you can think about this for yourself. And then later, when you have more time, you can potentially refer back to them and think about how you could be more effective at maybe helping people that you care about. But the first is obviously to observe and be aware that somebody might need help or support. The second is to find a way to make a connection with them. So we all make connections in different ways. It depends on the person and the situation. We might just want to show interest or ask them about what they're going through. But again, it's going to vary by the situation and the person. And people will find it difficult to tell their stories, to talk about stress sometimes. Some people talk about it pretty openly and willingly, but it really is going to vary by the individual. So this has helped people feel comfortable and at ease. And basically what that's saying is, like, people really won't tell their story about the stress that they're under unless they feel safe. They have to feel safe to do so. So in order to feel safe, they have to feel like they're in a safe place. So in order to do that, we find ways to help them feel comfortable and at ease in order to tell their story or to be present with us. And then along with that is, being kind, calm, and compassionate. A lot of times we talk about assisting with basic needs. And this can be really simple. And I have been a volunteer with the Red Cross for many years. And one of the first things we do when we help somebody who's gone through a fire, a flood, or whatever, is to offer them a bottle of water. So that whole basic idea of water, like when you get under a lot of stress, your body tends to, all the fluids kind of flow to your nerve endings, and people can get really thirsty and in need of water. So that's one way to attend to their basic needs. So that's something you could do. But maybe that whole way of just offering something to somebody, like water or coffee or tea or whatever, that just kind of helps them also feel at ease, but also assist with the basic need. That the next one is also a pretty prevalent and basic idea, like being a good listener. And think about the people that you go to in your life to talk about your problems. You're not going to probably turn to the most inattentive person that you know in your life, right? You're going to want to go to somebody who is a strong listener, a good listener. And so if you're that person, that's fantastic. If not, maybe you could get better and practice listening skills, because they really go a long way to helping people who are experiencing some type of stress or crisis in their life. The next idea, and it kind of goes along with what we talked about earlier with the realistic optimism, but being able to give people realistic reassurance. So I think sometimes if we're able to give a person reassurance that things are going to get better, or what we know about how they could get better, that's important. But the word realistic is important too, because if we tell people who have maybe just gone through something really intense in their lives, oh, I'm sure it's going to get better tomorrow. You won't worry about this tomorrow. That's not realistic, because we know people are going to experience that stress for a lot longer period of time. So giving realistic reassurance when you can. and saying, like, sometimes we'll tell children who know that they've experienced some type of crisis in their lives, and they're looking to adults to help them or to give them reassurance. We might tell them, and if you remember earlier that I mentioned that children often have their sense of safety impacted. And so you might tell a child, like, the adults in your life are going to do everything in their power to make sure that you're safe and that you're cared for. And that's not telling them, oh, there's nothing to worry about, because kids know when it's time to worry about something because they get their cues from us. And they're so in tune, kids are so in tune to emotions, to the affect, that they don't have to rely on words to tell them something's wrong. They go by emotions. So so we want to be realistic in terms of reassurance with them. And that holds true for adults as well. Now, sometimes with adults, we want to encourage positive coping in the face of stress, because a lot of times there is the inclination to choose maladaptive coping mechanisms when faced with a lot of stress. And unfortunately, it's become all too often it occurs in our culture today that people will use drugs or alcohol to turn to as a coping mechanism. So you want to then encourage people to use positive coping mechanisms, whatever those may be. Sometimes, and sometimes people turn to coping mechanisms that look like they're positive, but really they could have negative effects. For example, sometimes people will throw themselves into work as a coping mechanism, and that could be okay. But if somebody's not working 70 hours a week, that might not be the best and the most healthy thing for a person to do. So sometimes it's thinking about those as well, that we want to encourage people to turn to positive coping methods in their lives. And then in talking about those coping strategies, what are some positive coping strategies that you can think of or that you use? Think of those for yourselves. And sometimes we just automatically use them, but this is taking the opportunity to kind of think about what they are. And it also gives us the opportunity to expand, or have the potential to expand, what those coping skills are in our lives. And expanding those skills, the next question is, what coping strategies would you like to use more often? And so think about that for yourself and make a mental note of that, because that's something that can kind of be helpful going forward. Okay, and again, this goes along with that idea that we discussed earlier, that it is important that people are not isolated too long and that they have connections with other people. But sometimes people will choose avoidance. In fact, avoidance is a pretty common strategy for people experiencing stress. And so in order to combat that, we can help people connect with others. Maybe encourage them to call somebody who's important to them. Even that can be beneficial. Maybe there's somebody in the community that they can connect with. That's important. But helping people sometimes helping people connect is a great way to help them. If we have information, giving people accurate and timely information is a way to help them. So, and then suggesting additional help is another way that you can help. The last suggestion is talking about ending the conversation. And I guess that's kind of a skill. And when you're trying to help somebody using psychological first aid concepts, and maybe you've talked with them for a while, the last thing you want to do then when you're getting towards the end of your talk is to say, okay, we've talked for 45 minutes now. I have other things to do. And that wouldn't be perceived too well. But so just finding a way how do you end that conversation? Because that becomes really important in terms of how the person perceived your support. So you might what we sometimes say is to offer a bridge to maybe another opportunity where you're able to talk, or another time that you're able to get together, or another way that you can be in contact, maybe at a different time. So that's a good way to kind of end the conversation when you're using these techniques and these skills. So I guess, and thinking about this, you can see how many of these steps kind of run together when you're trying to help somebody. But again, hopefully that this was a good way of looking at this whole idea of helping and kind of what it looks like or what it can consist of. And so it is going to look different depending on the situation and who you're trying to help. So I hope that has been helpful in terms of offering some suggestions about coping in difficult times. And remember that nobody is going to be a perfect sage in terms of using these techniques, or even in helping. Even in helping children who are experiencing stress, we don't have to be a perfect sage. We just have to have the willingness to want to support them. And then we can learn from what we've tried and what's worked for us along the way. So I do hope that you have found these techniques to be helpful.